Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of T&D here by myself once again. This was going to become a regular occurrence because, I don't know, I feel like I stay more on track when it's just me, as I've found out. So that's what we're going to stick with for now. If I'll maybe try and get some more like guest players on as we do more episodes and the like, but for now, it's just little old me. And I am here today to talk about something that I never really thought I would be talking about, in all honesty, until around a few weeks ago. And it is dungeons, how to run them and how to kind of prepare for running one, etc., etc. I was first turned on to the love of dungeons when, it wasn't that long ago, really. I just kind of came to this realization a few weeks ago. James runs, he plays Theodard in our Curse of Strahd campaign. He runs Dungeon of the Mad Mage, there we go, for our group, or some of the group, on Tuesdays. I was probably on the more hesitant side to play in it, because it's not really, it wasn't really my thing. I'd never ran a dungeon longer than a session, I don't think. And I had a philosophy on it that was kind of its own separate thing. I thought dungeons were not exactly how I wanted to run a game. I got close to it. I stole a map off the internet and used that for a dungeon for a session. That all got thrown out of whack because of a bunch of sequences of events that had happened. But I never properly ran a dungeon, and my perspective on it was a little skewed. I thought, in all honesty, through a bit of, I don't know, learning and the like, I did the Sunless Citadel for a bit. That was for 2 players, which was, the balance was not there. It was really tough encounter after really tough encounter, and I had leveled them way up above what they should have, and that was only for a session or 2. I don't really consider that a massive dungeon because there's not that many amazingly funky things going on until you go down to the 2nd floor, which my players did not get to because they died to goblins. And I hadn't ran a proper dungeon since then, and I think after watching a few YouTube videos and watching people play it, my perspective on dungeons was the Sunless Citadel and Tomb of Horrors, which I don't really believe the Sunless Citadel is that amazing of a dungeon. It's alright, it gets the job done. And then there's also Tomb of Horrors, which is infamously known by the more modern D&D community as bit of a shit show. In comparison to if you asked a veteran, they would probably have a bit more of a liking to it, because that was more relevant back when D&D was around at that time, because D&D was about the dungeon and the dragon. The DMG back then, as Matt Colville said, was not advice how to build a world, a setting. It was advice on how to make a dungeon and anything that needed to go along with that to make it more believable, etc., etc. Now the game has expanded way beyond the concept of a dungeon and has kind of, in all honesty, in terms of how the DMG presents the game to the players, deviated from the concept and instead advise using it as more of a focal story point, which I believe is what a dungeon should be. If you want to run your players through a dungeon, it should have a reason within your story. Maybe you're just making a dungeon and you want your players to go in it. They will have infinitely more, they'll like it a lot more if they know what they're getting into. Dungeon of the Mad Mage frames this perfectly by the Yawning Portal having rumours spread around it that the players can pick up. Maybe they've heard some stuff about it. Maybe they know a bit of information about a few of the floors, and that's some of the ones that they're trying to get to. So there's a big motivation for getting into that dungeon. Ryan's character Hamish in that is off to go and find more magical secrets and the like. Plus he made an archaeologist. He's just going down there because he's an archaeologist as well. He's got some stuff to find out. But yeah, definitely think about why your dungeon is there, what it is doing there, who's been in it in the past, who's now in it, if anything. Depending on how big it is, if you've got a multi-floored dungeon, that is some, like, mega dungeon territory in terms of you might want to even add, like, a faction or a group, if you will. But we'll get onto that in a sec. For now, let's just talk about kind of how a dungeon works. So, basically, you have a set of rooms and corridors that join the rooms. This is kind of the base concept. You can mess around with that a little bit. They don't necessarily have to be rooms and corridors. They could just be vast cave networks with some parts of this cave being more open and therefore having more things in them, like perhaps an old camp that was destroyed by a monster that's nearby, etc., etc. There's a lot of other components that go into kind of the structure of one. Doors that lead into rooms, that lead into other rooms, that lead back around. There's a full lattice work that goes into, like, the way that a dungeon works. You can make yours as linear as you want or as complicated as you want. I generally go for a bit in between. I like to give my players more than one or two choices, and therefore the dungeon that I'm currently working on and will be running today has a load of different ways that they could go, but a lot of them lead to similar places as they would have if they were to take a different route. It saves me a lot of planning time while also making sure that they're going where I think they should be going. But ultimately it's their choice, and they might spend upwards from 1 session to 3-4 sessions in there, depending on how invested they are in this dungeon that I'm creating. Another key principle of the dungeon is secrets. When you're going through it, you don't just want the players to fight the monsters in there, get the loot, and get out. I believe that as part of a dungeon, you should come up with the context for why it's there, what it's doing there, and show that through the rooms in the dungeon, the monsters that are in there, the people that are in there, and some old relics of perhaps what it once was. The dungeon that I shall be running was originally created by Dwegar, or however else you want to say it, Dusk Dwarves, etc., etc. They built a large fort underground in the mountains and the like, to, you know, keep an eye on the area, and they were running from mind flayers at the time, so they'd kind of built it to be a bit magic proof and the like. So there's a few anti-magic effects going off around it. But then they were kicked out by the mind flayers, who managed to get in anyway and then promptly left because they didn't need that place. And then a faction moved in, which is the primary, or like a subsect of the primary bad guys' forces, if you will. And it's got some pretty interesting imagery that clashes. They worship their leader like a god. They're kind of like this monk who's managed to discover the art of destroying magic for good. And they're all like worshipping him for it, and this group is the Arcana Rebellia. And I've made, so like all of those anti-magic effects, they're the places that they use now to get rid of magic without the aid of their leader. Like, if they find a magical artifact, they're going to just chuck it in that anti-magic room, and now it's just disabled forever, etc., etc. There's a lot of different components that go into the way that I've specifically made it, due to the progression of time and how new and old groups have adapted to the environment that they've built and worked upon. And yeah, definitely come up with some new events. Again, I said this in my solving DM and player problems, is that as a DM, you should probably make the story revolve around the characters as much as possible. If you have a story that you want to tell that's bigger than the characters at their early level, that's cool, but try and make most events happen while they're there. Therefore, I have about 6 or 7 events in this dungeon that can happen depending on where they go, how they interact with things. There is an imprisoned young green dragon in the corner of one of the rooms who they can free, and she will help them until she finds an opportune moment to poison breath all over them and then run, because she's freaking lawful evil. And she does not want to associate with those people because she knows who they are. There is also a Gorgon in one of the corridors, which is a very bad place to fight a Gorgon. So that will be fun. And they've managed to get their way. They've been sneaking around the fort for a month, and they've finally emerged, killed a bunch of guards, and no one's noticed yet. And they've taken their broken statue faces and smashed them all up in the corridor for, I'm not entirely sure why, but it sounds cool when you're in the next room and you can hear stuff going off. What else have I got? There's the treasure room, which has a bunch of trophies of this group's victories and the like, guarded by a Gorth. Which, if you don't know what a Gorth is, it's a mini beholder that guards your treasure, but also will eat it if they're left unsupervised for a while. And it could be a social encounter if they wanted. They could walk in and he'd be like, hey, don't touch the treasure. And then they could be like, hey, do you want this magic item? And then he's like, yeah, sure, touch the treasure, I don't give a shit. Because Gorth are greedy as hell. And yeah, I have a lot of interesting stuff going on in that dungeon that I'm quite happy of in terms of what the players can do with them. My party is more likely to just start trying to kill them, but if they don't for some reason, then maybe, who knows? The bard just took calm emotions to kind of help with that a little bit, and yeah. So generally, I think let's talk about a room in a dungeon, shall we? So first, you want the entrance, the entry chamber, and I feel like this place should perfectly set up what sort of area it is. When they first enter the dungeon, give them a description of the general features, perhaps a constant noise that will be following them throughout the entire dungeon, a scent that isn't going to leave, and the like, and consider kind of this entry room will set the scene for the rest of your dungeon. Unless you specify that a certain room looks very different to the rest, they're going to assume that your starting room is the same as the rest of the dungeon in terms of its design, which is cool, which is fine in my opinion. But definitely let them know that kind of like this is going to be a constant throughout the entire dungeon for the sake of your ease, so they don't ask like every half an hour, wait, what's this made of? Unless it's like a door. Doors can be made of different things and be locked and unlocked and have a bunch of conditions for that. But yeah, I think that the starting room is very important and should, in my opinion, lead to more than one other place. My starting room in this dungeon that I'm going to be running tonight has two different ways that they can go. One is locked, and they might try and unlock that and go through that, or they might try and go through the unlocked one and save them some time and trouble. Either way they go, they might end up looping back on themselves because of the kind of way that the dungeon is structured. But it definitely lets them experience different things at different times and lets their choices feel like they've impacted what's happening. Plus, it's really satisfying to watch the map build up as you go and see the weight of your decisions carry on over when the session ends and you zoom out and you see what progress you've made today in the dungeon and the stuff like that. I'm quite a fan of the Explorer mode feature on Roll20 because it documents the entire dungeon as you go, and it's kind of cool to look back on it as a player because you can see exactly where you've been and what you've seen. Okay, so generally let's talk about more to do with chambers. More specifically, how you should describe one. I think Jim Davis in his video about mega dungeons said it pretty well. Flavor text you don't need for every single room. Maybe for the starting room, and maybe for a tense moment that you'd like to frame for that room. Other than that, I think a bullet point list of a few important things, as once again Jim Davis said. And that's kind of how I formatted it. Bullet point a particular scent, if there's a strong scent in the room, a sound that the party can pick up. A few obvious visual things in the room that they can perhaps interact with. And after all that, then you can describe if there's any sort of creature in there. I think that generally, when you're making a dungeon room, there should be a higher than average chance that there's something in there. Be it an inexpensive item that is maybe worth 30, 40 gold, to a magic item, to a trap, to a trick, to a dominant monster, to a group of the faction, etc., etc. You can have an empty room, and there's definitely credit to be given to an empty room because it can give the players more of a suspense. Instead of what's in this room, it becomes, is there something in this room? Which is a much more frightening thing to think about when you open a door, because you're not reliably going to know if there is actually something in that room. That can create a little more tension. So for instance, I have a storage room that has nothing of interest in it except some rations and water and the like. And yeah, that's pretty much the only thing that's in there. Whereas the room next to that, I believe, is a bathhouse with not much in there either. But they could also go a different direction and not go to the bathhouse. And instead they walk into a shrine to their leader, which a bunch of people are currently stood around worshipping them at. And unless the party is wearing the signature mask of the faction, they will be deemed as hostile and will try and immediately take them down. I don't know if my party will pick up on the fact that you could pick up a mask, put it on, pick up their trench coats, put them on, and you've suddenly got their ensemble and you might be able to pass off as them. Because there's a lot of them, frankly. And it doesn't always just have to be something that's out there to kill them either. It could be a cool puzzle that they could completely ignore if they don't feel like doing a complicated puzzle. I have a puzzle in there that I took from Tasha's that involves the gemstones that you can kind of like hear the names of, and then you can put the pieces together and then say a key word, and then the hand's open and you've got a 5,000 gold piece gem. There you go. I've put a lot of loot in my dungeon. The party will not find all of it, that's for sure. And I definitely think as a DM, you should put loot fucking everywhere. Like, every little place, because players are going to want it. They want to go into a dungeon and they want to kill shit, get money. That's kind of the objective of a dungeon. And sure, there is also, other players might have other motives. Perhaps one wants to find out more information about the faction. One wants to find out why the heck is there a green dragon in here, etc., etc. And give them a little bit of all that and just see what happens. So there's corridors and the like, and deciding the width of a corridor is actually a key thing. If you're going 5 foot wide, then your players are going to feel very claustrophobic. It's going to give them a sense of, once they're up against something in this corridor, there is no feasible way that they're going to be able to wriggle their way around it. They are stuck in this 5 foot line. If you wanted to frame an encounter that way, I definitely recommend doing that. Once you go to 10 foot wide or beyond, that is when the players are going to feel much safer. I have a couple 5 foot wide corridors that I don't know if I've actually put anything in them, but it can definitely add to a bit of tension because thin corridor, of course. So I generally really liked putting the dungeon together that I've made. It was really fun to kind of like, and I'm still doing it. Once I finish this podcast, I'm going to go back and work on it. I've got about 25 rooms at the moment, and the way I've done it is generally there is more room than corridor. You can change this up as you wish. Finding your own balance between chamber, corridor, door, portal, etc., etc., if you ever wanted to put one of those in. It's completely up to you. Sometimes, like in, I think Half-Life's a good example of this, there's the vents, which are similar to the concept of the corridor in a dungeon, is that it's kind of like some quiet time to ponder on, okay, we've just been in this room. What does that mean for us while you're just walking along? And maybe it could also be a moment to talk to other people in your party, roleplay with them and the like as you're walking through the corridors. And unless your DM jumps something out at you, more often than not, in comparison to a room in a corridor, you're going to be safe. Because corridors in dungeons are mostly meant to embody the transition between one chamber to another. You can certainly pull some weird shit. If you want to do, like, for most of the dungeon, corridors are a safe space, and then near the end, suddenly the boss jumps out in a corridor. They're going to be like, oh fuck, well, this has just screwed us over, because we thought we were safe. Definitely play around with that sort of element. There's a lot of interesting techniques you can do to add and take away suspense in a dungeon and the like. I think one of my favourite parts of these dungeons is thinking of these scenarios that my players will get into and planning for them. I genuinely expect most of my party to just pile drive through all of the encounters with people. They could certainly talk with them and try and pass themselves off as members of their group. They don't have to, and they could. I've balanced it so that they could fight them and kill them. There is a reasonable amount in each room where they could fight them. In a dungeon, like, outside of a dungeon, you can make encounters that the party are not exactly supposed to win, I think. Definitely be careful with that and the balance and the like, and you could even warn them out of character. Like, this is a tough encounter, guys. A retreat is an option, trust me. Like, that can help your party, because players don't want to flee, but if you think it owes to the story and will give them a better experience, then I think you could do it if you do it right. However, in a dungeon, I don't really think that should be an option, because where are they going to retreat to? And why would they when they've come this far already? And stuff like that. I've created a pretty difficult final boss, but depending on the conditions of when they encounter them, they might be easier. This kind of boss has a couple of people in the room next to them that they can just shout to and they'll come out. But other than that, they're going to have to go out of their way for reinforcements. And by themselves, they can certainly do well, but their hit points are not great. And that is a big downfall for them. And they're not going to be able to take a round or two by themselves. So therefore, they're going to need help. And the party can cut off their help. They could stand in front of doorways and they can bar them up. And they can just grapple the dude and put a hand over his mouth and stuff like that. But if they don't, he could perhaps get even more reinforcements and end up with a much bigger chance of getting some good amount of damage in. Let's talk about traps, shall we? I have put about 2 or 3 traps in there. One of them is a room that is partially submerged in water that the party can go in. And the moment one person does, they're trapped in there and it starts filling. That's a pretty classic way to build a lot of suspense. The Star Wars scene where the walls start closing in, that is very, very tense. And I think that might be fun to interact with, where one person's stuck in there. I've specified the AC and hit points of the doors so that they could perhaps smash those down if people wanted to. Also, the main way that you're supposed to do it, which I'm not sure if they'll ever pick up on, but the steel door that shuts them in has like a hole in it where you could put like a small sized disc, and the dead corpse in the corner is clutching onto that disc in their right hand, and they can't see it, but they know that they're clutching onto something. So they could perhaps do that, but knowing my party, they're probably just going to try and smash the walls down, which is also how you can do it. But steel door, it will be hard, and they'll have a few rounds to do it before they start drowning. So I've kind of placed it in an area where nobody really goes. I have the primary dungeon in like the north and the east and the west. The south is a bit more isolated. It's not lit. It's a bit just shitty. There's not many rooms there either, and this place is a long gone abandoned place because they're like, well, that place is fucking pointless, so they've left it. And therefore I think that should create some foreshadowing in terms of there should be a trap here, right? Because, you know, that's where the old stuff is, and that is an old Dwergar magical trap that they put in that is activated through just proximity magic and stuff like that. Definitely adds a little bit more to the world building, especially since it is a Dwergar who was actually dead in the corner as well. And once they're out of there, they are rewarded with that disc, which is actually worth about 250 gold. If someone survives a trap, they should have something to come out with, in my opinion. Even if it's just a simple dart trap and they dodge it, the knowledge that there are dart traps in this dungeon is a great reward. And there's probably not going to be more than one floating death chamber in that room, in that dungeon, but once they come out of it with loot, they'll feel like they did a good job in comparison to just getting out and moving on, you know? That's kind of my philosophy on traps. Similarly, there is one in our corridor, which is the one time I'm going to make them, other than the Gorgon, having anything in a corridor. And it's another statue of their, like, worshipped, quote-unquote, deity, who has his hands out and he has gems in them. And if someone tries to take one, the roof falls down. This is a trap that people can actually be prepared to see beforehand. If someone looks up at the ceiling, they will notice loose rocks and the like that could potentially topple down on them. And even if the rocks get toppled down, there is a chance that people could get out. They have to use like 50 feet of movement to move 5 feet in the rubble, but other people can start dragging them out as well, and they could come back out with some pretty neat gems. And yeah, that's kind of my philosophy on traps, because it's kind of just a gut punch if they have a trap and then they just have to keep going and they're like, well shit, that's about 50 hit points just gone, thank you. Yeah, it's not that nice when that happens. Nevertheless, traps definitely big thing, as well as like trick items and the like. That can always be a lot of fun as well. Just make them feel like, and even if the trap doesn't give them an immediate reward, maybe the reward for getting through the trap is the door on the end, which is the treasure room, and then stuff like that, which isn't so wrong for me. That trap with the leader with their hands out is just before getting into the main leader's room, which has the treasure room around it as well. So that's kind of the premise of that sort of area. There's plenty of other ways they could learn a bit more lore about the place. This faction has access to a unique armor that they can make, which is like better than studded leather. And if they go into a specific room in there, they might get the schematics to make it. One character in the party has proficiency with smith's tools that they'd learned in downtime, so they will be able to use those if they pick them up to make that armor, which is very cool in my opinion. And yeah, I've added a lot of stuff that I just think they could come out of this dungeon and have a lot, and they would feel like the sessions that they spent in there were worthwhile. And there's plenty of stuff to keep them interested in the story too. Every few rooms pertain to this leader, Seth. They have imagery of it all around. The masks that every guard wears, the shrines in various areas and the like. There's rooms dedicated to him and welcoming him. There's an entire section of the dungeon dedicated to, hey dude, welcome, we're going to show you around. And there's like a banquet hall, and there's the posh guest room that Seth has that's bigger than the actual leader of the dungeon. And I will actually be rolling at the start of when they enter the dungeon to see if this Seth figure is there, because there is a 5% chance that he will be in the dungeon when they enter, and every day from there, because he sometimes visits to say hello, or to make everyone fear him and love him at the same time. because that's a good villain thing, to make everyone hate and love them at the same time. Loki is a perfect example of that. Kind of inspired a little bit from Loki with this guy. I have still got a lot of bloody rooms to make, and I'm nowhere near done with the dungeon. I have a lot of things that I need to iron out. I need to figure out properly the balance between loot and the like. I think that something else that I've played around with a little bit is secret doors. I don't need to explain those too much. You just got to put a secret door in a few places, because then it means that the dungeon has secrets. I have a secret door chamber where the guy, the main leader of the fort, keeps his own personal cache of magic items that he doesn't exactly want to give up and just throw into the dispelling chamber and stuff like that. The party might be able to discover. One of which is a Rod of Alertness, which is a very cool magic item. Not necessarily very rare, I wouldn't say it's that, but it's very good. It's pretty interesting in terms of it lets you cast all of the seeing spells and stuff like that. And there's also a saddle of something, Saddle of the Cavalier, and our paladin has a horse, so they're going to really appreciate that. And they're the only one who hasn't really had a full-on magic item yet, so I hope that they discover that. Nevertheless, I definitely have more to say about a dungeon, in terms of more specifics and how they work, in terms of every room, purpose of such. But I'll get onto that in a later episode. For now, I've been talking for half an hour. Thank you everyone for listening. I still don't understand why, people watch these, in my opinion, but I mean, thank you nonetheless. We here at Magical Tea Party are putting a fuckload of effort into everything that we do here. We've got 3 videos a week and a stream that also counts as a video in my eyes, because then it gets uploaded to the video afterwards. But yeah, you're probably going to be having to get used to seeing my room now in terms of the actual main video recordings, because for now we're in lockdown in England and I have an okay webcam and an okay mic and a ring light. So, here we are in my room. I hope that you guys can bear with us and stick around until we've properly got everything back up and ready again. Hopefully we don't dip too much in terms of viewership, just because, I don't know, they don't get to see that cool background that we normally have with the wood wall. Thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.